Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a leisurely stroll through history, through the origins of the Silk Roads. Picture this: vast deserts stretching endlessly under a burning sun, the whiff of spices in the air, the glint of precious silks glimmering in the hands of travelers, and ancient caravans crossing rugged mountain passes that only the bravest would dare to traverse. These were the paths where traders, explorers, and entire empires met, blending their cultures and goods in a way that forever changed the world. But let's be honest, this was not an easy journey for the adventurers of the past. You probably wouldn't last a day out there, dodging bandits, surviving sandstorms, or walking for weeks without a single oasis in sight. Yeah, I'm serious. But before you start worrying, let's get comfortable and sink into this story together. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Let's see how far these ancient routes truly reached. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The origins of the Silk Roads are not quite what you might expect. These legendary trade routes didn't just appear out of thin air. They grew out of necessity, curiosity, and the dreams of merchants who sought to find new markets. Imagine it, thousands of years ago. You're a merchant in ancient China, perhaps in the Tang dynasty, and you've just heard rumors of far-off lands. You've heard whispers of spices and treasures from the west, of distant cities where rare silks could fetch unimaginable sums. So, you gather your goods, gather a caravan, and head out, embarking on a journey that will change the world. Historians still argue whether the concept of the Silk Roads was born out of a single visionary plan or whether it simply happened over time as traders, driven by greed and the hope of riches, followed these paths. What we do know is that by the 2nd century BCE, these routes had become essential to the world economy. The first documented mentions of these trade routes are often linked to the Han Dynasty in China. This was the moment when the Emperor Zhang Qian was sent on a diplomatic mission westward in search of allies to help fend off invaders. But what he returned with was far more valuable than alliances. He brought back tales of cities brimming with goods, people eager to trade. His reports helped open the doors to what would become the famous Silk Road. At first, the trade was limited and slow. Caravans were small and journeys could take years to complete. These merchants weren't just selling silk. They were selling luxury goods, jewels, tea, paper, and later, even gunpowder, goods that were so precious they could only travel in the hands of the most trusted travelers. But as trade blossomed, so did the routes, weaving their way across deserts, through mountains, and even along coastal lines. As you close your eyes, imagine the sound of camel hooves slowly sinking into the sand beneath them, the rhythmic clinking of trade goods, and the warmth of the desert sun. It's almost meditative, isn't it? Now that we've set the stage, let's step into the world of these ancient pathways. Close your eyes again and picture what it must have been like for those first traders embarking on these epic journeys. They weren't just walking into the unknown, they were facing some of the most inhospitable terrain on the planet. Deserts so vast, you'd think they'd never end, and mountain ranges so high the air would feel thin and cold even in the summer. And yet, somehow they crossed it all, treading the paths that would one day connect east and west. You may wonder, how did they do it? How did ancient travelers manage to make their way through these seemingly endless, desolate spaces? Well, the answer lies in the resilience and resourcefulness of the people who roamed these early Silk Roads. You see, those initial routes were often pioneered by nomadic tribes who knew the land like the back of their hands. These tribes, like the Scythians in the north or the Kushans in the east, had no settled homes. They were wanderers with an intimate knowledge of the terrain. Historians still argue whether these tribes were simply opportunists, taking advantage of the growing demand for goods, or if they were pioneers in a much larger sense, seeking a way to connect cultures and people long before anyone else. One thing is for sure, without these nomads the Silk Roads would have remained just a scattered collection of isolated points on a map. It was their unique way of life, constantly moving, always adapting, that enabled them to survive and thrive in a world that others feared to enter. Imagine the skill it must have taken to lead a caravan through the Gobi Desert. The endless dunes would distort your sense of direction, but the nomads had a special kind of wisdom. They read the stars at night to guide them and the wind patterns during the day. The scent of rain was their compass, and the occasional oasis wasn't just a stop for water. It was a small piece of paradise where traders could rest, share stories, and trade news. The people in these caravans weren't just passing through, they were building connections, fostering an early sense of community, and sharing knowledge in a way that no one could have predicted. Then, as the routes began to stretch farther, over mountains like the Tian Shan and the Pamirs, these nomadic guides would often form alliances with local people, helping to bridge the cultural divide. And remember, while these nomads were essential, they weren't the only ones involved in this early stage of the Silk Roads. Eventually, merchants from the more established civilizations in China, India, and Persia would become regulars on the road as well. Yet, for all the ancient wisdom of these early travelers, there were still dangers on the road, many of which had nothing to do with the geography. The vast distances between oases meant that traders often ran low on food and water, and the lack of proper maps made the journey a guessing game. No GPS, no road signs, just the endless horizon ahead, with the faint hope of reaching the next stop. You can almost feel the hot wind blowing against your face, can't you? The sense of uncertainty, the thrill of discovery, each new step a gamble with the unknown. But despite all that, these traders kept going, driven by the hope of something greater on the other side. It wasn't just about trading goods, it was about connecting with distant peoples, learning new languages, and sharing knowledge across cultures. As traders made their way along these routes, they weren't just moving goods like silk and spices, they were also moving ideas. Slowly, the Silk Roads became more than just a trade route. They became a cultural exchange. Ideas from the West, philosophy, science, art, began to make their way east. In return, Eastern innovations like paper and printing were passed back along the route. And remember, none of this could have happened without the sheer tenacity of those early travelers, those who were willing to risk everything for the possibility of a better life for themselves and for others. As these ancient trade routes grew and began to cross even more regions, the landscape of the Silk Road started to transform. No longer just the domain of the nomadic tribes, the routes now passed through kingdoms and empires, vast networks of cities, each with its own distinctive culture, art, and way of life. But these traders were not just bringing goods to sell, they were bringing with them the stories, knowledge, and customs of their homelands. The Silk Roads became a massive cultural melting pot, blending the traditions of East and West in a way that had never been seen before. The first goods to flow along these routes were, of course, the prized silks from China. In the beginning, this luxurious fabric was more valuable than gold. Historians still argue whether the silks were seen as a symbol of the emperor's power or just a commodity that commanded a hefty price, but there's no doubt they were a driving force behind trade. The Chinese were the world's masters of silk production, and they kept the secret of how it was made for centuries. When the Persians first saw the fabric, they were so entranced that they began importing it in vast quantities, later becoming some of the most important Silk Road traders themselves. But silk wasn't the only good traded. Spices, perfumes, and precious stones all made their way along these ancient roads, creating a complex web of commerce that stretched over thousands of miles. Traders from India brought exotic spices like pepper, cinnamon, and ginger, while merchants from the Arabian Peninsula carried frankincense and myrrh, materials that were used in religious rituals as well as daily life. And don't forget about the famed horses from Central Asia, strong, fast, and in high demand from the Chinese imperial courts. Imagine the scene. Merchants bartering under the shade of grand bazaar tents, the smell of burning incense mixing with the spices in the air. The chatter of multiple languages fills your ears as you stroll through the market, surrounded by items from distant lands. Silks shimmering in the sunlight, bowls of saffron and cinnamon being offered by traders, their faces lined with the wisdom of countless journeys. It's a scene you could almost lose yourself in. Historians still debate the true origins of the first silk traders. Some believe it was an enterprising merchant from the Han Dynasty who first dared to journey west, while others think it may have been a much earlier exchange, sparked by the sheer will of individuals seeking something beyond their borders. However, one thing is clear. Once the idea of trading goods for profit took hold, the entire region was swept up in a frenzy of commercial activity. But the goods exchanged were not the only form of currency moving along these routes. Ideas were just as valuable, if not more so. The spread of religions, such as Buddhism from India to China, transformed the spiritual landscape of the entire continent. Imagine the Buddhist monks in flowing robes, slowly making their way along the trade routes, carrying with them sacred texts and teachings. These monks weren't just bringing religious beliefs, they were also sharing art, philosophy, and even architectural styles. Alongside the spreading of religion came the exchange of technology and science. The Chinese, for example, learned about astronomy and medicine from the Persians, and the Greeks introduced new ideas in mathematics and engineering. Some of the world's earliest ideas about medicine were shared along the Silk Roads: recipes for remedies, techniques for treating diseases, and the beginnings of the medical practices that would influence Europe and the Middle East for centuries. You could almost imagine the blending of cultures as these ideas and beliefs spread. A single road, carrying not only material goods but the very foundations of what we know today. And with every new idea or invention shared, the connections between far-flung cultures grew stronger, setting the stage for even more exchanges to come. The trade was no longer limited to just the exchange of goods. It had become a cultural exchange, a fusion of different ways of life. And yet, with all the positives, there were still challenges. The sheer size of these trade routes meant that there were multiple entry points, which also meant there were numerous places where traders could get lost, fall prey to bandits, or face the harsh elements. And let's not forget the role of the Roman Empire. As it expanded, the Romans established their own connections along the Silk Roads, although they were more interested in the luxury goods coming from the east than in actively trading along the routes. Their demand for silk was insatiable, and so they played a pivotal role in opening new markets for the east. Their empire was a huge cultural influence, and their desire for silk led to them eventually finding their way to the source. Historians still debate whether the Romans actively sought out the east, or if the east simply found them, but either way, the Roman influence was undeniable. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the streets of ancient Rome, where traders arrive with wagons piled high with silk. The Romans marvel at the rich colors and delicate fabrics, amazed by the sheer artistry that goes into producing each piece. Meanwhile, Roman soldiers stand guard, watching the busy markets, where the demands for spices, fabrics, and other luxuries never seem to slow. It's a world on the brink of transformation, where the trade of one material could change an empire. As we move forward, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer scale of the Silk Roads. By this time, the ancient routes had evolved into one of the most extensive trade networks the world had ever seen. No longer limited to a handful of caravanserais scattered across deserts and mountains, they had transformed into a bustling highway that spanned continents, connecting the far-flung civilizations of Asia, Europe, and Africa. Imagine for a moment, stretching from the deserts of China, through the mighty mountains of Central Asia, down to the ports of the Arabian Peninsula, and all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. It's a vast and intricate system, woven together by the people who traversed it. But it wasn't just the merchants who made the Silk Road so essential. The real secret to their success was the infrastructure that arose along these routes. Caravanserais, those ancient inns designed specifically for merchants and their animals, dotted the landscape. These were far more than just rest stops. They were places where cultures mixed, goods exchanged hands, and travelers could rest safely from the dangers of the road. Think of the caravanserai as a sort of medieval airport terminal, where merchants from different corners of the world could meet and trade news, goods, and stories. Inside, the air would have been filled with the sound of bartering, laughter, and the occasional argument over prices. Spices and silks were traded for wheat, wool, and pottery. And every now and then, the smell of freshly baked bread would mix with the scent of cinnamon, cumin, and saffron in the air. As the sun set, the travelers would gather around a fire to share tales of the road, the distant lands they came from, and the people they met along the way. But the true lifeblood of the Silk Roads wasn't just goods, it was the people. The traders who made these long and grueling journeys weren't just driven by the promise of wealth. They were also motivated by the spirit of adventure, curiosity, and the desire for something more. Many of them had traveled for years, crossing countless lands, only to return home with stories that would eventually be shared with generations to come. Imagine the exhilaration of crossing a desert that stretched for days, only to reach the distant oasis that marked your first stop in a land you'd never seen before. The land was foreign, but it was a place you had come to know through stories, through dreams, and through sheer will. Yet, despite the opportunity for cultural exchange, the Silk Roads weren't free from tension. With all the traffic flowing between empires and nations, it was inevitable that conflicts would arise. The vastness of these trade routes made them susceptible to a wide range of threats, from the natural dangers of the terrain to the very human dangers posed by robbers and bandits. These marauders were an ever-present danger, lurking on the fringes of the caravanserais and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Imagine being a merchant in one of these caravans, constantly looking over your shoulder, knowing that at any moment, you could be attacked by a group of bandits desperate for your goods. Historians still argue about how the Silk Roads could have been so simultaneously dangerous and thriving, with all these threats present. Was it the protective nature of the empire-based merchants, or the informal alliances that traders formed to safeguard themselves? Perhaps a little of both. Even in the face of danger, traders and travelers kept coming. They were motivated not just by the wealth of the world's greatest empires but by the promise of discovery, the chance to experience the richness of foreign cultures, to bring something new back to their own lands, and to contribute to the vast web of human connection that stretched across the world. After all, the road wasn't just about the destination. It was the journey itself, the people you met, the goods you exchanged, and the knowledge you gained, that defined it. In many ways, the Silk Roads were the original global network. They connected disparate lands and people, some of whom had never even known the other existed. Yet, the roads created a shared experience that transcended borders and brought together civilizations that might have otherwise never encountered one another. It wasn't just about trade, it was about the exchange of ideas, the mingling of cultures, and the sense of being part of something far greater than yourself. As you drift off, think about how, even now, the spirit of the Silk Roads lives on. In every exchange of cultures, every trade agreement, and every international flight, you can feel the echoes of those ancient traders. The world is still connected in ways that would have seemed impossible to the people who first walked those paths. So, as you lay here, let yourself drift into sleep, knowing that the world you wake up to is still shaped by those ancient roads that brought the world closer together. The vastness of the Silk Roads wasn't just a geographical feat, it was a logistical marvel. To cover the distances, merchants and their caravans had to work together like finely tuned machines, each component designed for a specific purpose. Every stop along the road was part of a larger system, carefully orchestrated to ensure that goods, people, and ideas could travel as efficiently as possible. But this level of coordination was no small feat. The sheer number of cultures, languages, and customs involved meant that the very act of trading wasn't just about bartering goods. It was about bridging divides, forging relationships, and finding common ground in a world that was often divided by vast distances and cultural differences. When you look at the maps of the Silk Roads, it's almost impossible to imagine the scale. We're talking about thousands of miles of land stretching across deserts, mountains, and dense forests. The caravans that made their way across these distances were composed of everything from camels and horses to oxen, each chosen for its specific suitability for the terrain. Camels, for example, were known as the ships of the desert, because they could survive for long stretches without water, making them perfect for the desert crossings of Central Asia. Horses, on the other hand, were preferred for the more mountainous routes, where speed and agility were essential. Historians still argue over just how many different caravans were needed to keep the Silk Roads functioning. Some estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of traders, merchants, and their animal companions were constantly on the move. Each caravan was like a traveling city with its own economy, social structure, and set of rules. The merchants were the heart of this operation, but they were also part of a much larger network. One that included guides, translators, craftsmen, and soldiers who ensured safe passage through hostile territory. Despite the vast complexity of the routes, the system itself was surprisingly flexible. The merchants didn't just stick to the well-established paths, they constantly adapted, discovering new shortcuts, safer routes, and alternative methods of transport. For instance, during certain seasons when the mountain passes were blocked by snow, traders would sometimes rely on river routes instead, navigating the great rivers of Central Asia like the Amu Darya and Sir Darya. This flexibility was key to the survival of the Silk Roads, and it allowed the system to endure for over a millennium. Imagine, though, what it must have felt like to be part of one of these caravans, not knowing if you'd make it to your next stop. The environment was harsh and the people were not always welcoming. Yet, despite the dangers, the Silk Roads were paved by an unyielding spirit of perseverance. There were incredible risks at every turn, robberies, harsh weather, and political instability, but they were counterbalanced by the promise of discovery and trade. And then there were the stories that were passed along from one caravan to the next, from one traveler to the next. Every stop along the Silk Roads was an opportunity to share stories, to exchange knowledge, to recount adventures. If you were a traveler on the road, every conversation you had might be your only chance to hear about the wonders of far-off lands. Consider, for instance, the famous story of Zhang Qian, the Han Dynasty diplomat whose journey westward opened up the Silk Roads in the first place. It's said that when he returned to China, he described a vast world of kingdoms and people beyond the desert. Historians still debate the accuracy of his accounts, but the effect was clear. His journey and the stories he brought back helped fuel the idea of what the Silk Roads could become. On the road, every merchant was a storyteller in their own right. They shared tales of the places they'd been, the goods they'd traded, and the people they'd met. These stories, though often embellished or distorted by time, formed the cultural exchange that was integral to the Silk Roads. Much like how today we connect with others through social media, back then, it was these face-to-face encounters, these shared stories, that truly brought people together. Yet, despite the richness of the Silk Roads, the merchants knew that they could never rely on just the roads themselves. The success of these trade routes also depended on the relationships they fostered along the way. Much like how modern traders rely on trade deals and business partners, those ancient merchants depended on trust. Trust that their goods would be accepted, trust that the guides would lead them safely, and trust that they could get their precious wares to the right markets. And when they arrived at the end of their journey, it wasn't just the exchange of material goods that mattered. It was the connections they had made, the people they had met, the cultures they had learned about, and the friendships they had forged. The Silk Roads in many ways were more than just a route. They were a network of human connection, one that spanned continents and shaped the world in ways that are still felt today. Now, let's take a closer look at one of the most important elements of the Silk Roads, the goods themselves. While silk was the star of the show, it wasn't the only treasure that traversed these ancient routes. Over the centuries, merchants exchanged countless items, each one carrying its own significance, both in terms of value and cultural impact. The Silk Roads weren't just about trade, they were about the fusion of ideas and the sharing of knowledge that took place with every precious item that was passed between traders. Let's start with silk, since it's the name we all associate with these ancient routes. The first surprise? The Chinese kept the secret of silk production to themselves for centuries, and no one outside their borders knew how it was made. Historians still debate how exactly they managed to keep the process a secret for so long, But we know that it wasn't until the 1st century CE that the knowledge of sericulture, the cultivation of silkworms, began to spread beyond China. Before that, silk was so valuable that it was sometimes used as currency. Imagine paying for your lunch with a single strand of silk. Now that's a luxury item. The Romans were the first to truly desire Chinese silk, which was seen as a symbol of wealth and status in the Mediterranean world. In fact, silk was so highly prized that it led to some very strange situations. Roman emperors tried to acquire silk through diplomatic means, and even went so far as to send spies into China to discover the secret of silk production. Eventually, silk made its way to the Roman Empire via Persia, and it became a highly sought-after commodity in both the East and the West. For a time, the Romans were willing to pay anything for it, even if it meant draining their coffers. But silk wasn't the only thing that traveled along the Silk Roads. Spices were another key trade good. Imagine the rush of aromatic scents that would have filled the air as traders unloaded their goods: saffron, cinnamon, cloves, and pepper. Spices were used not only to flavor food but also for medicinal purposes, making them highly valuable. In ancient times, spices were seen as magical, almost like a form of medicine, an elixir that could cure ailments or enhance one's vitality. The exchange of spices along the Silk Roads was so profitable that entire empires were built on the spice trade. Historians still argue whether the spice trade was driven more by necessity or luxury. Some suggest that the demand for spices came from the need to preserve food, as refrigeration didn't exist back then. Others believe it was more about status. Being able to show off a fancy spice like cinnamon was a way to display wealth and influence. Whatever the case, the aroma of these spices filled the markets of ancient cities, and their influence stretched far beyond the kitchens. But there were other goods that played a less obvious role in the story of the Silk Roads. One of the more fascinating trade items was paper. Imagine, if you will, a time before books were easily accessible. Paper was an extraordinary innovation, and its arrival in the West, via the Silk Roads, marked a major turning point in human history. The Chinese were the first to create paper, and once it was introduced to the rest of the world, it revolutionized communication, education, and record-keeping. The importance of paper can't be overstated. It was one of the key technologies that helped spread knowledge, ultimately leading to the great intellectual movements of the Middle Ages and beyond. Another lesser-known item was the humble horse. Horses played an essential role in trade, not just as beasts of burden but as prized possessions in their own right. The famous steeds from Central Asia, particularly the ones bred by the Mongols, were highly sought after by empires like the Chinese. These horses were faster and stronger than many of the animals that were used in the West, making them essential for both trade and warfare. The Mongols, in particular, understood the value of horses and used them to great advantage in their conquests, which often relied on fast-moving cavalry to dominate vast swaths of territory. And let's not forget the precious stones and metals that were traded. From the deep blue lapis lazuli of Afghanistan to the gold of Central Asia, these treasures were highly prized by the elite of every culture along the Silk Roads. Traders moved precious stones from the Indian subcontinent to the Middle East, to China, where they were fashioned into jewelry, amulets, and ornamental objects. Gold and silver were exchanged for luxuries, and these metals were not just used for practical purposes. They were symbols of power and prestige. Yet, for all the material wealth that flowed along the Silk Roads, it's important to remember that these items were not just about making the merchants rich. They were about connecting the world. Silk, spices, paper, horses, gold, and gems were all part of a much larger cultural exchange. Each of these goods carried with it ideas, traditions, and customs that would shape the course of history. The Silk Roads were more than just a trade route. They were a meeting place for civilizations, a crossroads where the ancient world could come together and share its wonders with one another. As you drift off to sleep, imagine the exotic goods being unloaded at one of these bustling caravanserais, the bright, shimmering silks, the scent of spices mixing with the warmth of the desert air, the glitter of precious stones in the sunlight. These items weren't just physical goods, they were the lifeblood of a cultural exchange that helped shape the world as we know it. As the centuries passed and the Silk Roads expanded, the exchange of goods became intertwined with the exchange of ideas, philosophies, and religions. The roads were no longer simply a pathway for merchants to peddle their wares. They had become a conduit for the very essence of human culture. While merchants traded silks and spices, travelers, diplomats, and scholars shared stories, philosophies, and religious beliefs that would profoundly influence the world. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Silk Roads is the way they facilitated the spread of religion. Perhaps the most famous example is the journey of Buddhism from India to China. Imagine Buddhist monks, draped in simple robes, walking across deserts, mountains, and foreign lands to share their teachings. They didn't just carry scrolls and scriptures. They carried a way of life, a philosophy that would resonate with millions of people across Asia for centuries to come. Historians still debate the role of Buddhism in the development of the Silk Roads. Some argue that it was the religion's ability to adapt to new cultures and environments that made it so successful in spreading along the trade routes. Others believe it was the result of a deliberate mission by Buddhist monks who sought to spread their beliefs far and wide. Whatever the case, Buddhism's influence spread like wildfire, eventually reaching China, Korea, Japan, and even Central Asia. But Buddhism wasn't the only religion to travel these roads. Islam also found its way to the heart of Asia through the Silk Roads. Beginning in the 7th century as the Muslim Empire expanded across the Middle East and North Africa, the influence of Islam spread eastward along the trade routes. Traders and missionaries carried the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, and soon the bustling markets of Central Asia, India, and China saw the rise of new mosques and Islamic communities. The Silk Roads were a melting pot of spiritual exchange. Alongside Buddhism and Islam, there was the influence of Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, and Nestorian Christianity. Each of these religions left its mark on the Silk Roads, shaping the societies and cultures they encountered. The vast reach of the Silk Roads allowed these belief systems to merge, adapt, and evolve, creating a shared religious and philosophical landscape that spanned continents. Consider the bustling city of Samarkand, a hub of cultural and religious exchange on the Silk Roads. In its markets, you could find traders selling everything from Chinese porcelain to Persian carpets, while nearby, a mosque stood proudly beside a Buddhist temple. The sounds of different prayers, from the chanting of monks to the call of the muezzin, echoed in the air. The people who traveled through these cities weren't just crossing borders, they were crossing spiritual and intellectual boundaries as well. But the exchange wasn't limited to just religion. The Silk Roads were also a conduit for the transmission of scientific knowledge. As merchants and scholars traveled from east to west, they brought with them groundbreaking discoveries in astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. For example, the Indian numeral system, which included the concept of zero, traveled along the Silk Roads and eventually made its way to the Arab world. From there, it would spread into Europe, forever changing the course of mathematics and science. Another key area of knowledge shared along the Silk Roads was medicine. Chinese herbal remedies such as ginseng and ginger were traded along with new surgical techniques and medical theories. These ancient practices blended with the medical knowledge of Persia, India, and the Arab world, creating a diverse and evolving body of knowledge. Medicine was a significant part of the Silk Roads exchange. After all, healthy traders and travelers meant a healthier economy. Historians still argue whether these intellectual exchanges were purely accidental or if there was a more deliberate effort to spread knowledge across borders. One thing is for certain, the Silk Roads were not just highways for merchants, they were highways for ideas. And just as goods were exchanged, so too were innovations and inventions. What we take for granted today, our systems of mathematics, medicine, and technology, were shaped, in part, by the travels of those who journeyed along the Silk Roads. As you drift off, imagine the bustling marketplaces of these ancient cities, where the air is filled with the sound of different languages, the scent of incense, and the rustle of silk. It wasn't just goods that made their way along these routes, it was the very essence of human knowledge and culture. These ideas, these stories, and these beliefs were as precious as any treasure. And in the quiet of the night, think of all the intellectual exchange that took place along the roads, shaping the future of humanity with every step. As we continue our journey through the Silk Roads, it's impossible to ignore the golden age that these trade routes enjoyed. The period between the 7th and 13th centuries saw a flourishing of commerce, culture, and knowledge that spanned much of the known world. The Silk Roads, which were once a scattering of isolated pathways, transformed into one of the world's most essential and vibrant economic lifelines. Empires grew wealthy, cities prospered, and new technologies emerged, all thanks to the thriving trade that connected east to west. At the heart of this golden age were the great empires that controlled parts of the Silk Roads. In the east, the Tang and Yuan dynasties ruled China, bringing with them a period of relative peace and prosperity. Under the Tang dynasty, China saw a cultural renaissance, with innovations in art, literature, and even the creation of the first printed books. This cultural boom led to an increased demand for goods from the West, while also encouraging the Chinese to expand their trade networks. Silk, tea, and porcelain flowed out of China, while new ideas, techniques, and technologies flowed in. But it wasn't just China that benefited from the Silk Roads. In the West, the Byzantine Empire flourished, situated at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. The Byzantine Empire served as the intermediary between the Eastern and Western worlds, facilitating trade between the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. The famous Byzantine silk industry, which began around the 6th century, owed its existence to the Silk Roads. The Byzantines learned the art of silk production from the Chinese, and soon, they were creating intricate silk textiles that were in high demand throughout Europe and the Middle East. Historians still debate whether the Byzantine Empire's success was entirely due to its strategic location or whether it was the result of specific policies designed to foster trade. One thing that is certain, however, is that the Silk Roads played a major role in strengthening the Byzantine economy and culture. The trade of goods and ideas enriched the empire, turning cities like Constantinople into thriving centers of commerce and culture. But the Byzantine Empire was not the only power that reaped the benefits of the Silk Roads. The rise of the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his successors brought about a period of unprecedented peace and stability across much of Asia, known as the Pax Mongolica. Under the Mongols, the Silk Roads flourished as never before. The empire's vast territory, stretching from China to Eastern Europe, allowed for the free movement of goods, people, and ideas. The Mongols encouraged trade by ensuring the safety of merchants along the routes and promoting the exchange of cultures. This period of Mongol rule saw the Silk Roads at their peak, with vast caravans of traders, diplomats, and adventurers crisscrossing the empire. At the same time, the Mongols maintained a strict system of taxation and regulation, which allowed for the efficient exchange of goods and services. The resulting flow of goods, everything from silk and spices to weapons and slaves, created immense wealth for the Mongol rulers, and cities like Samarkand, Baghdad, and even Venice became wealthy trading hubs. But beyond the commerce, the Pax Mongolica also allowed for a blossoming of intellectual and cultural exchanges. The Mongols were known for their tolerance of different religions and cultures, and they actively sought out scholars, scientists, and artists from across their empire. As a result, the Silk Roads became a channel for the spread of not just goods, but also knowledge. Scholars traveled freely between China, Persia, India, and Europe, sharing their discoveries in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and even philosophy. One of the most famous figures to travel the Silk Roads during this golden age was the Venetian merchant and explorer Marco Polo. Polo's journey to China and his subsequent return to Europe in the late 13th century helped introduce the West to the wealth and wonders of the East. His famous book, The Travels of Marco Polo, became one of the most influential works of the Middle Ages, offering Europeans their first detailed glimpse into the cultures and technologies of the Far East. Polo's accounts, though often exaggerated, sparked a wave of curiosity and trade between Europe and Asia that would continue for centuries. Despite the flourishing trade and cultural exchanges, this golden age wouldn't last forever. The rise of new empires, the shifting tides of politics, and the advent of new technologies all contributed to the eventual decline of the Silk Roads. But during their peak, the Silk Roads were a symbol of the vast interconnectedness of the world, a network that united people across continents and brought cultures together in ways that had never been seen before. As you drift off to sleep, think about the incredible empire that the Silk Roads once represented. Imagine the bustling cities, the grand trade caravans, and the vibrant exchange of ideas, all happening under the watchful eyes of emperors, merchants, and adventurers. The world was a much smaller place when the Silk Roads were at their height, and that interconnectedness, that shared experience, is something we still carry with us today. As we continue to trace the winding paths of the Silk Roads, it's essential to address a pivotal moment in history, the eventual decline of these ancient trade routes. While the Silk Roads flourished for centuries, the same factors that fueled their growth began to chip away at their stability. The delicate balance between culture, commerce, and communication was disturbed by a series of crises that eventually led to the collapse of one of the greatest networks of trade and knowledge the world had ever seen. The first major blow came in the form of invasions. While the Mongols had once provided a period of peace and prosperity across Asia, their empire eventually splintered into smaller, warring factions. These conflicts, combined with the rise of other powerful empires, destabilized the once secure trade routes. As the Mongol Empire fragmented, the safe passage that traders had once enjoyed became increasingly difficult to maintain. In the 14th century, the disintegration of the Mongol Khanates created a series of barriers, both physical and political, that made it harder for merchants to travel with the same ease and safety they once had. Historians still debate the impact of the Mongol collapse. Some suggest that the loss of Pax Mongolica marked the beginning of the end for the Silk Roads, while others argue that the emergence of new powers and trade routes simply shifted the focus elsewhere. The rise of the Ottoman Empire in the West and the growing influence of European maritime trade in the East began to pull the focus away from the traditional land-based routes of the Silk Roads. Sea routes, which had once been secondary, became the preferred method of transporting goods. The opening of direct sea routes to India and the Americas in the 15th century, fueled by the age of exploration, provided more efficient alternatives to the ancient pathways across Asia. Meanwhile, the emergence of new technologies played a role in shifting the balance of power. The development of gunpowder, for instance, changed the nature of warfare, and the spread of these new weapons altered the political and economic landscape. The once guarded trade routes that connected the East to the West were no longer as secure as they had been in the past. Raiders, both from neighboring regions and within the countries themselves, became a significant threat to the merchants who once had the relative protection of the empires behind them. But the collapse of the Silk Roads wasn't just about political instability, it was also about changing economic priorities. The growing demand for European luxury goods in the East during the 16th century began to reshape the balance of trade. European traders who had long been reliant on the Silk Roads to acquire silks, spices, and porcelain, now found new, quicker routes to satisfy their growing demand. The direct maritime routes from Europe to Asia offered a faster, cheaper alternative to the overland trek across Asia, effectively making the Silk Roads less essential. Yet, the most significant blow to the Silk Roads came in the form of the bubonic plague. The Black Death, which swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, was an outbreak of unimaginable scale. While the plague's impact was felt most profoundly in Europe, it had far-reaching consequences along the trade routes. The disease spread rapidly along the Silk Roads, carried by traders and travelers, decimating entire populations along the way. The fall in population not only weakened local economies but also disrupted the flow of goods, making it harder for the Silk Roads to continue functioning as they once had. In the aftermath of the plague, the political, social, and economic landscape had shifted dramatically. The once thriving cities along the Silk Roads, which had served as bustling hubs of commerce and culture, began to wither. Trade slowed to a crawl, and many of the cities that had been key to the Silk Road's network became shadows of their former selves. Samarkand, once a jewel of the Silk Roads, began to lose its luster as its strategic importance waned. Historians still debate the reasons for the decline of the Silk Roads. Was it the result of one event or a combination of factors? Some argue that the shift in global trade patterns, combined with internal conflicts and external pressures, gradually made the ancient routes obsolete. Others suggest that the very nature of the Silk Roads, built on the exchange of goods, cultures, and ideas, was bound to fade once the major empires began to evolve into more isolated states. But even in their decline, the legacy of the Silk Roads lives on. Though the ancient overland routes became less traveled, the world's trade networks and cultural exchanges are still shaped by the principles that these roads established. The networks of trade, communication, and cultural diffusion that began on the Silk Roads continue to operate in the form of modern global commerce and diplomacy. We are still, in many ways, walking the same paths that those ancient traders once tread. As you begin to drift off, think about the quiet cities and forgotten roads of the Silk Roads. Though they have fallen into history, their influence persists in the world around us. The Silk Roads weren't just about the exchange of material goods, they were about the connections we make with one another, the stories we share, and the knowledge that we pass along. The ancient roads, though silent now, echo with the lives and legacies of those who once walked them. Even as the Silk Roads slowly faded into history, their impact was not forgotten. The cultural, intellectual, and economic exchanges that these ancient pathways facilitated continued to shape the world long after the merchants had stopped traveling along them. The legacy of the Silk Roads lived on in the civilizations that had been touched by their vast web of trade and communication. The routes may have closed, but the ideas, inventions, and practices that moved along them continue to echo through history. Take, for example, the introduction of paper to the Western world. As we mentioned earlier, paper was one of the many precious commodities that traveled along the Silk Roads, from China to Persia and eventually to the Middle East and Europe. It's no exaggeration to say that the spread of paper radically changed the course of history. The invention of the printing press in Europe, centuries later, would not have been possible without paper. Without paper, books would not have been printed, and the spread of literacy and knowledge would have been far slower. In many ways, the intellectual flourishing of the Renaissance in Europe was built upon the cultural exchanges that took place along the Silk Road centuries earlier. Historians still debate whether the introduction of paper was the sole driving force behind the spread of literacy or whether it was part of a broader cultural movement. What's clear is that paper revolutionized the way people communicated and exchanged ideas. It helped to bridge the gap between cultures, facilitating the spread of knowledge, religion, and political thought. Ideas that had once been confined to small pockets of civilization were now able to travel across borders, shaping the intellectual landscapes of entire continents. Similarly, the transmission of medical knowledge along the Silk Roads had a lasting impact. As merchants and scholars moved along the trade routes, they brought with them not only goods but also knowledge of medicines, treatments, and medical practices. Chinese herbal remedies, for example, were passed along to Persia and the Islamic world, where they were integrated into the medical knowledge of the region. This knowledge, in turn, influenced medical practices in Europe and continued to evolve through the centuries. The impact of these exchanges can still be seen in modern medicine, where many ancient remedies and treatments continue to be used. Yet, while the physical roads may have disappeared, their influence on the way we think about global trade and cultural exchange remains ever present. The Silk Roads laid the groundwork for the interconnected world we live in today. As trade routes expanded and empires grew, the principles of cooperation, exchange, and mutual benefit that characterized the Silk Roads found their way into modern commerce. The idea of global trade, of moving goods and ideas across vast distances, is not a modern invention. It was first practiced along the ancient Silk Roads. As you settle into the stillness of the night, take a moment to think about the threads that connect the past to the present. The Silk Roads were more than just a series of ancient trade routes. They were a symbol of human ambition, ingenuity, and connection. The desire to exchange goods, to understand different cultures, and to share knowledge transcended time and space. In the stillness of the night, as you prepare to drift off to sleep, remember that the connections we make today are just echoes of those ancient pathways that once linked the world together. The Silk Roads may be a distant memory, but their legacy endures in the way we communicate, trade, and connect with one another. As we reflect on the lasting impact of the Silk Roads, it's important to consider the modern-day revival of this ancient network. Though no longer a dusty, camel-trodden path through deserts and mountains, the spirit of the Silk Roads has found new life in the global trade networks of today. The Silk Roads may have been abandoned by the merchants of old, but their essence still permeates the trade routes, diplomatic relations, and cultural exchanges that bind our world together. In recent decades, the notion of reviving the Silk Roads has taken on new significance, as governments and organizations look to create economic and cultural ties across the globe. The modern initiative known as the Belt and Road Initiative, launched by China in 2013, aims to rebuild many of the trade routes that once defined the ancient Silk Roads. This project, which involves the construction of roads, railways, ports, and pipelines across Asia, Africa, and Europe, aims to reintegrate the economies of these regions and promote cross-border trade. It's an ambitious attempt to recreate the interconnectedness that once existed along the Silk Roads, facilitating a flow of goods, services, and ideas. But even as the modern world has embraced the spirit of the Silk Roads, there are challenges that remain. The sheer scale of the project requires a level of international cooperation that can be difficult to achieve in today's geopolitical climate. There are disputes over trade policies, concerns about the environmental impact of large-scale infrastructure projects, and debates over the balance of power between countries. Despite these challenges, the vision of the Silk Roads as a global network that fosters cooperation, economic growth, and cultural exchange continues to inspire leaders and thinkers around the world. Historians still argue about whether the original Silk Roads were truly a global network, as they were primarily focused on trade between Asia and Europe. Some suggest that the modern world's emphasis on interconnectedness and globalization is a direct continuation of the ancient legacy, while others point out that the scale and complexity of modern trade are far more sophisticated than anything the ancient world could have imagined. One thing is for sure: the spirit of the Silk Roads, with its emphasis on cultural exchange and mutual understanding, remains a powerful influence on global relations today. And the Silk Road's influence is not just confined to economics and trade. As the modern world becomes increasingly globalized, we are witnessing a renewed interest in cultural exchanges, much like those that took place along the ancient routes. The movement of people, ideas, and cultures across the globe has never been easier, and the modern Silk Roads have become a metaphor for the way people from different backgrounds and traditions are coming together. Whether through travel, digital communication, or international collaborations, the Silk Road's legacy lives on in the way we connect and learn from one another. As you drift into sleep, imagine the future where cultures and ideas are as freely exchanged as the goods that once traveled along the ancient routes. The world is more interconnected than ever, and the modern Silk Roads serve as a reminder that the exchange of knowledge, goods, and traditions has the power to shape the world for the better. Though the physical roads may have disappeared, the connections they once fostered continue to grow in new and exciting ways. As we venture deeper into the legacy of the Silk Roads, it's important to reflect on the profound cultural exchange that occurred along these routes, far beyond the mere exchange of goods. The Silk Roads were not only an economic network but also a platform for the spread of art, literature, philosophy, and even food. These roads served as a literal and figurative meeting place for civilizations, where ideas that shaped the course of human history converged. One of the most significant cultural contributions of the Silk Roads was the spread of artistic styles and techniques. Think of it like a giant moving museum, where the treasures of one culture would inspire the creativity of another. For example, the Byzantine Empire's magnificent mosaics found their way to the Islamic world, while Chinese porcelain influenced the pottery traditions of Persia. These exchanges weren't simply about copying art, they were about cultural reinterpretation. The intricate designs of Chinese pottery were admired by Persian artisans, who infused them with their own artistic flair. This cross-pollination led to new styles and forms of artistic expression that would continue to evolve for centuries. In addition to visual arts, the Silk Roads were instrumental in the spread of literary traditions. The tales of the East found their way to the West and vice versa, in ways that transformed literature across continents. One of the most notable exchanges was the introduction of Persian poetry to the Islamic world. The works of poets like Hafez and Rumi, whose origins lay in the Persian heartland, gained immense popularity across the Silk Roads and became integral to the intellectual and spiritual life of the Arab world. These poetic traditions, rich with philosophical and mystical themes, eventually influenced Western literature as well, particularly during the Renaissance, when European thinkers rediscovered the philosophical works of the Arabs. Historians still argue about the extent to which these literary exchanges shaped the cultures they touched. Some scholars argue that the influence of Persian poetry in the Islamic world was immense, while others believe that the true impact came later, when these ideas spread into Europe. Regardless of the exact timeline, it's clear that the Silk Roads played a central role in the transmission of literary forms that continue to shape our understanding of poetry, philosophy, and storytelling today. But perhaps the most tantalizing cultural exchange that took place along the Silk Roads was the spread of food. While silk, spices, and jewels were the obvious commodities traded along these ancient routes, foodstuffs were just as important, though perhaps less appreciated in the historical record. Spices like saffron, pepper, and cinnamon, some of the most valuable commodities of the time, traveled from Asia to Europe, while foods like rice and sugar moved westward. The exchange didn't stop there. Even today, many of the foods we consider staples in one culture have their roots in the Silk Roads. Take noodles, for example. They were first introduced to Italy via the Silk Roads from China. These humble strands of dough, originally an Eastern invention, would become the foundation of one of the most beloved dishes in Western cuisine. Some scholars suggest that the famous Italian pasta tradition was born from Chinese noodle-making techniques brought along the Silk Roads by traders and explorers. Likewise, sugar, which originated in India and spread across the Silk Roads, transformed cuisine across the globe. It played a key role in the development of desserts in the Middle East, Europe, and beyond, and its cultivation sparked the growth of the sugar trade, which continues to be a major industry today. Historians still debate the timeline and nature of these food exchanges. Some argue that the spread of crops like rice and sugar was relatively slow, while others believe that the Silk Roads helped to rapidly disseminate culinary innovations across cultures. Whatever the case, there's no denying that the Silk Roads played a crucial role in shaping the food we eat today, from the spices in our kitchens to the noodles on our plates. As you let yourself relax and settle into the quiet of the night, think about the influence of these cultural exchanges. Imagine the flavors of distant lands mixing, the sounds of foreign languages echoing through the markets, and the ideas and stories being shared under the shade of ancient trees. The Silk Roads were far more than just a trade route. They were a living, breathing network of ideas, cultures, and people, all woven together by the simple desire to connect. As we look to the future of the Silk Roads, we see that their legacy is still very much alive, even though the physical roads may no longer exist in their original form. The spirit of the Silk Roads, the exchange of ideas, goods, and cultures, has been resurrected in the modern world through global trade, international diplomacy, and technological advancements. The advent of the internet and global connectivity has created a new kind of Silk Road that stretches across the digital world, bringing together people and cultures in ways that the ancient traders could only have dreamed of. Imagine, for a moment, how the merchants of the past would have reacted if they could see how far-reaching their legacy has become. Today, businesses and individuals can connect with anyone across the world in an instant, facilitating the rapid exchange of goods and ideas. The rise of e-commerce, global supply chains, and multinational corporations has essentially created a modern version of the Silk Roads, where goods are still exchanged across vast distances. Just like the ancient merchants who journeyed for months to deliver their wares, modern traders now send products worldwide with the click of a button. The modern world may not have camel caravans crossing deserts, but it certainly has the equivalent in air cargo and shipping containers that move goods across oceans and continents. While we no longer rely on land routes to exchange goods, the idea of connectivity is still very much a part of our lives. Globalization has transformed the way we interact with one another, making the world feel much smaller. With social media platforms, people from different cultures can engage in conversation and exchange ideas almost instantaneously. Just as traders once met in the bustling bazaars of Samarkand or Chang'an, today's digital world allows us to meet, share, and learn without ever leaving our homes. Historians still debate the implications of this level of connectivity. Some argue that it's leading to greater cultural understanding, while others believe it's eroding cultural identities in favor of a globalized, homogenized world. What's clear, however, is that the spirit of the Silk Roads lives on in our ability to share, connect, and understand one another in ways that previous generations could not have imagined. The exchange of culture, like the exchange of goods, continues to shape the way we live, work, and think today. The Silk Roads weren't just about the exchange of material goods. They were about the sharing of knowledge and experiences. In the modern age, we continue to see the importance of cultural exchanges. Artists, writers, musicians, and thinkers are still borrowing from each other, blending styles, and creating new movements. The globalization of art, music, and literature mirrors the way that cultures once blended along the Silk Roads. What was once exchanged in the form of silks and spices is now exchanged in the form of digital art, film, and music. But, beyond trade and culture, the legacy of the Silk Roads can be seen in the spirit of diplomacy that still exists today. The Silk Roads were not just about business. They were also about fostering relationships between empires, kingdoms, and peoples. As diplomats and traders navigated the complex web of cultures and languages, they laid the groundwork for the diplomatic networks we rely on today. The act of negotiation, of finding common ground, is still a critical element of modern international relations. From the United Nations to bilateral agreements between countries, the Silk Road set the example for how trade and diplomacy could coexist to foster peace and cooperation. In a way, the Silk Roads are still an ideal that we strive toward. A world where people from different cultures can connect, learn from one another, and build a better future together. While the roads may no longer be physically present, the principles of the Silk Roads, commerce, cooperation, and cultural exchange, remain an essential part of the global landscape. As you drift into sleep tonight, think about the ways the modern world mirrors the ancient one. The digital roads we travel now are the successors to the Silk Roads, connecting people and ideas just as the traders of old did. The legacy of those ancient pathways is far from over. It lives on in every interaction, in every exchange, in every global conversation that takes place. So, as you close your eyes and let the world settle into quiet, remember that the ancient Silk Roads may have ended, but their journey continues in each of us. As we draw closer to the final chapters of the Silk Road story, it's essential to pause and reflect on the legacy that still lives in the world today. The roads themselves may have disappeared, but the exchanges that began along these paths continue to shape our modern world in ways we might not even realize. From the goods we consume to the way we think about the world, the Silk Roads laid the groundwork for much of our global interconnectedness. The ancient spirit of curiosity, adventure, and exchange lives on in the everyday interactions that define our current era. One of the most significant ways the Silk Roads still influence us today is through the global economy. The world we live in now, with its sprawling networks of trade and interconnected markets, is built on the same principles that made the Silk Road so vital. The flow of goods from one part of the world to another is just as important now as it was in the past. The speed with which goods, information, and people travel across the world has transformed the way we do business and connect with one another. It's hard to imagine a world without the kind of trade and commerce that the Silk Roads initiated. Think about the clothing you wear, the food you eat, or the technology you use. All of these items likely come from far-flung corners of the globe. Whether it's the cotton from India, the spices from Southeast Asia, or the electronics from East Asia, the spirit of the Silk Roads lives on in the global marketplace. Companies today, much like the traders of old, rely on an interconnected network of suppliers and buyers that spans continents. The goods we consume are the modern-day equivalent of the silks, spices, and jewels that traveled the ancient trade routes, and they reflect the same cultural exchange and interconnectedness that defined the Silk Roads. But the Silk Roads were more than just a network for trade. They were also a conduit for human movement. Today, more people are traveling internationally than ever before, whether for business, education, or leisure. Much like the traders, pilgrims, and diplomats who journeyed along the ancient routes, today's travelers are engaging in a global exchange of ideas and cultures. Just as the ancient Silk Roads facilitated cultural diffusion, so too does modern travel. The rise of tourism, international study programs, and even online communication platforms has enabled the exchange of ideas, traditions, and knowledge in ways that the traders of old could only dream of. The modern world, with its digital Silk Roads, also mirrors the ancient routes in the way it fosters intellectual exchange. The Internet, with its vast networks of information, serves as a modern equivalent to the flow of ideas that once passed along the ancient roads. Think of the way scientific research is shared across borders or how news travels across the globe in seconds. In a way, the Silk Roads were the original Internet. They connected people from different parts of the world, allowing them to exchange ideas and knowledge. Today, the digital world continues this legacy, enabling people to share knowledge and collaborate in ways that transcend geographical boundaries. Yet, for all the advances in communication, the core of the Silk Road's legacy remains the same: human connection. The essence of these ancient pathways was never about the goods being traded. It was about the people and cultures meeting, blending, and growing together. In our world today, where international collaboration and cultural exchange are more important than ever, we can look back at the Silk Roads as an example of how these connections can transcend borders. Whether through trade, diplomacy, or personal interactions, the Silk Roads remind us that our world is deeply interconnected, and that our shared experiences are the foundation upon which we build our futures. As you close your eyes and settle into sleep tonight, think about the ways the world you wake up to tomorrow is shaped by the ancient connections that the Silk Roads began. The roads may be silent now, but the spirit of cooperation, curiosity, and exchange that defined them continues to resonate across the globe. From the smallest conversation to the largest international agreements, the legacy of the Silk Roads is alive in every interaction, every connection, and every bridge we build with one another. As we approach the final moments of our journey through the Silk Roads, it's fitting to reflect on how the paths of ancient traders, scholars, and adventurers are still guiding us today. The world, much like the ancient Silk Roads, continues to evolve, and yet the themes that define those routes, curiosity, collaboration, and cultural exchange, remain timeless. The Silk Roads not only shaped the past, they continue to shape the present and future of global society. In the modern world, we're constantly reminded of how interconnected we are. The rapid pace of technological advancement has allowed us to communicate instantly, share ideas across continents, and trade goods in ways that the ancient traders would have never imagined. The Internet, as a modern incarnation of the Silk Roads, has transformed how we engage with the world. Information now flows freely across borders just as silk, spices, and ideas once did. We can connect with someone halfway around the world with just a few clicks, creating a new kind of global community. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Silk Road's legacy is their role in shaping our understanding of global citizenship. Just as ancient traders traversed vast distances to learn from other cultures, we too now have the opportunity to engage with a wide range of traditions and perspectives. In a world that can often feel divided, the Silk Roads serve as a reminder that despite our differences, we all share common aspirations. Whether it's the pursuit of knowledge, the exchange of cultural expressions, or the desire to understand one another, these ancient paths continue to remind us that connection is possible, even across seemingly insurmountable divides. Think about the cities along the Silk Roads, places like Samarkand, Baghdad, and Chang'an. These were once bustling centers where people from every corner of the known world gathered, traded goods, and shared knowledge. In the same way, modern cities and digital platforms serve as meeting points for cultures, ideas, and innovation. These cities were vibrant hubs of exchange, where diverse communities lived side by side, each bringing their own unique contributions to the tapestry of human culture. We can draw inspiration from these ancient centers of civilization, recognizing the value of embracing diversity, fostering collaboration, and sharing our collective wisdom. As we conclude this journey, take a moment to appreciate how the Silk Roads taught us that the world is far more connected than we often realize. They show us that when we step out of our comfort zones and venture into the unknown, there is a world full of opportunities for exchange, discovery, and growth. The legacy of the Silk Roads is not just about the physical roads or the goods that traveled along them, it's about the spirit of human connection that continues to define our global community. Now, as the night settles in and the world grows still, remember that we are all, in a sense, travelers along the Silk Roads of today. The journey of cultural exchange, of sharing knowledge, and of building relationships across borders, is ongoing. The ancient roads may no longer be traveled by caravans, but the spirit of those traders, those thinkers, and those adventurers continues to guide us. The world is full of connections waiting to be made, and it's up to us to continue the work that began long ago. So, as you drift into sleep, let the quiet of the night remind you that the journey of the Silk Roads is not over. It's a journey we are all still part of. The roads may have faded, but the connections they fostered, the ideas they spread, and the cultures they brought together remain with us. Sleep well, knowing that the legacy of the Silk Roads is alive and well in the world we continue to build together.